Hi, everyone. It's your boy, John. I don't know if I ended up getting the tone and inflection of Richard C. Meyer, formerly known as Diversity in Comics, now known as Comics Matter, and the author of this book, Jawbreakers, Lost Souls, which I will be reviewing today. And I'm doing a little bit of an homage to his style of reviewing by not scripting this video. I usually will script the reviews and things like that, but I felt today I'll just go ahead and kind of shoot from the hip and kind of give my overall thoughts on this book. Now, I will try my best to not include spoilers to the best of my ability, but there will be a few. So for those of you that are not interested in any kind of spoilers, well, then you might not want to watch this video. But like I said, I'll try my best to stay away from them. For the most part, this is overall going to be a spoiler-free review, and the things that I do touch up upon, I think, or at least to the best of my knowledge, shouldn't spoil the story for you. But yeah, like I said, you have that option available to you. Now, as many of you know, this book is going to be, there's going to be a second print run of it. So again, for those of you that don't want spoilers, then yeah, this is going to have some spoilers in it. But let's go ahead and just get into the book here. Obviously, as you can see right off the bat, Ethan Van Sciver cover, fantastic, love it. As soon as I opened this book up and started reading it and saw this first page, this immediately elicited a 90s vibe for me, because this reminded me a lot of Jim Lee's artwork, specifically his run on the X-Men book. If you guys remember that, in the early 90s, there was Uncanny X-Men, but then they released a book just called X-Men. So when I saw this kind of harkened back to Jim Lee for me. And I don't know if that's what they were going for when they did this page, but that's what it felt like to me. And reading throughout this whole first story, the Lost Soul story, there's a lot of stuff in here that feels nostalgic, right? Like the tone of the book is definitely a 90s feel, but it's interesting because it has a 90s feel to it, but it never feels like it's actually set in the 90s, which is, I think that's what Richard C. Meyer was going for. Of course, I can't speak for him, but that's what it feels like, that these are guys that, of course, have that kind of mindset, the mindset of the heroes then, or the feel of those heroes then, but they're not in that time frame, which is cool. But there's things, of course, like this, scantily clad women in this, the way they joke around and things like that. The way the team is, the powers are like, that was a time, I think, especially the 90s, there was a lot of this kind of really innovative and different type of powers really starting to pop up across different books. People having these unique kind of powers. Of course, that's something that's always been a thing since from the beginning of comic books, but it especially felt prominent in the 90s. And I could just be saying that because, of course, I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, so probably for me it just seemed like that. But what I mean by that is just like the certain powers that these heroes have, like Silkworm's powers, for example. He's super strong, but he also has, like, he shoots off these things that, like, wrap things, right? And he could kind of use them almost like a Green Lantern, in a sense, where he can make kind of constructs out of them, right? So it's a lot of stuff that feels like it was created in the 90s, and especially when you think about, like, Green Lantern, I think in the 90s specifically is really where you started to see a lot more innovation done with those powers. So that's kind of what I guess I'm paralleling, that I'm gonna parallel it to, right? Is that. But the team, of course, consists of Silkworm, Devil Dog, Cuffs, Hell Priest, and Knife Hand. And I'll explain the characters in a moment here. But this first story, the good thing about it is that it was well-paced, I thought. There was never a point in time where, and not just this story, but throughout the entire book, there was never a point in time where I felt that it was a drag to read. Now, I'm not going to say that the first story, Lost Souls, that it blew my socks off, but it definitely, it did what it was supposed to do. It got me interested in the characters, and it made me want to know what was going to happen next, because that's a big thing for me in comics. I'm not sure, and maybe some of you may or may not agree, but if I'm not invested by, I don't know, by the third or fourth issue, if it doesn't get me into it, there's a pretty good chance that I'm probably not going to like it all that much, if at all. for the Power Rangers review that I did, that was one of the biggest, or the issues, the Power Rangers issues that I did, that was one of the biggest problems that I had, is that even after 7 issues in, I never felt like, okay, I have to read the next one. They started to feel like a chore to read, and that to me is, at least to me personally, that's the sign of a not of a not so good comic book. Of course, I have heard that later on they do get better, and sometimes it just takes time with certain books. But for something like this, it's a one-shot. I think that's key. You want to get people interested right off the bat. And while, like I said, it doesn't blow your socks off, I think it does at least that much. It definitely did enough to pique my interest where I'm like, okay, let me see what else happens. I want to know what happens next. So it did that job. This first story, Lost Souls, definitely did that job. I think the only thing I don't like about the first story, and this is going to be a spoiler, but it's not a big one, is I didn't care for the way the relationship between Cuffs and Zazie was handled, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name right. I just felt that it didn't feel organic at all, in my opinion. It's like they met each other, they're attracted to each other, and what is this whole thing, right? This whole adventure that they're on in this first book, it's seemingly something that's taking place over the course of a couple days. Unless, there's more time, unless it's been weeks. That's not really clearly defined here. It feels like it's something that is really, their relationship is literally developing over the course of a couple days, and they make it seem like it's a lot deeper than what it actually is, and it never feels like that. It never feels like you can't really get behind this romance because there's not enough time to really build it up, to really build up this strong bond between them. So I felt that was a little bit cheesy. It reminded me a lot of how the relationship between Elektra and Daredevil was in the Daredevil movie with Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner. It kind of reminded me of that. It wasn't not a whole lot of time to. That had a little bit more time to build up the romance, right? But this one, it felt to me like I didn't care for it all that much. Like, to me, it was just like, it's whatever. It's just there. So that's the other thing I didn't care for with the book. But by the end of the first story, I definitely wanted to know what was going to happen next. I thought that the arc that they leave it on, this whole story here, and I won't get into that because I don't want to spoil that. There's a lot to go off there, and there's a lot of story that they can tell with that, right? Especially as it relates to the leader of the team, which is Silkworm. I think there's a lot to be told there, but I'm going to go ahead to the next part here. I'm going to get past the first story, which is Lost Souls, because also included in this was book 1 of Jawbreakers, which of course was the introductory book. And when you read these stories, even from Lost Souls, and Richard C. Meyer does say this later on when you read through this, that his inspirations for this book were things like G.I. Joe, more recently Guardians of the Galaxy, and a couple others. From the time that I read the first story, I definitely felt that G.I. Joe influence. And for those of you that grew up reading the 80s and 90s G.I. Joe comics, you'll know exactly what I mean once you read this, that you could feel that inspiration drawn from there. And of course, things from the 90s as well, the tongue-in-cheek humor and things like that. And this is the introductory story. I guess for the reprinting of it, they did the whole, make the pages look, old and stuff with the yellow. So I thought that was a nice little touch to it. But this serves as a decent introductory story. But my favorite story in this book is actually book 2 of Jawbreakers, because that's where I really felt that, of course, by then you've read 2 other previous stories, but to me that really felt like the one where the characters are fleshed out the most is here in book 2. This is the one I probably enjoyed most because of the humor, because of the pacing of it, and you really, I think for me, at least personally, this is the one where they really kind of flesh out all the characters the most. Richard C. Meyer really fleshed them out the most in this particular story, I felt. You really learn about the characters much more, or at least that's what it feels like. You see what happens with Devil Dog. You see that Cuffs is kind of like, it's almost like he's he's trying to be a stereotype, a stereotype or a typical trope of the strong guy in the group. And it's funny because Silkworm calls him on that. He's just like, hey, you ain't that guy. Stop trying to front like you are that guy. So I thought that was kind of funny. The funniest thing for me was what happens with Knife Hand, which I won't spoil, but it's pretty funny, I thought. But Knife Hand is, the best way for me to describe Knife Hand is he's what would happen if he's like Snake Eyes. If Snake Eyes from G.I. Joe had no F's left to give, you would get Knife Hand. That's pretty much that's pretty much what you get with him. My favorite characters though in this were probably Hell Priest and Devil Dog, of course. Hell Priest being the blind guy in the group, but there's a lot about him to like. He's a guy. He's really convicted to his faith. But all his interactions with the group, I think Hell Priest's interactions with the group are probably my favorite, because he's like he's got this you just really have to read, but it's his moral barometer, right? Is one of the things that's funny when you juxtapose that to some of the other characters in the group. It's hilarious. This book, especially the second book, because it goes into this whole story of the God King, it definitely feels like a setup for another Jawbreakers book, which I believe Richard C. Meyer has said he's going to do. I'm not sure. I know he said that he's going to do a God King book, so he lays the groundwork for that with this story. So I don't know if it's going to be a thing of God King being the sequel to this book, or if there's going to be a God King origin book, and then there's going to be another Jawbreakers book after that to kind of, set the stage for that. But there's definitely a lot of in this particular issue, I felt this is probably where there was the most world building done, in my opinion. So I like the graphic novel overall. I definitely think it's worth it, especially if you are somebody that, and not just somebody that was reading comic books in the 80s and 90s, but are just trying to enjoy a story for what it is. Just fun characters with interesting personalities that have interesting interactions with each other. Because that's another thing I felt too, like the way that they talk to each other kind of reminded me a little bit of how the conversations go in certain like Kevin Smith movies, right? Where it's just, sometimes it's about just some of the conversations that these characters are having, and they're funny. So there's a couple different things that it felt like Richard C. Meyer drew inspiration from, and I'm not saying Kevin Smith is one of them, but it's like it's this mixed bag of all these different things that I felt were fun for the book. It's a fun read overall. Now, it's not anything super, super deep, but you get the sense, especially in this book, that there's some stuff that is starting to come to the surface that can get really deep, and it's something that I'm looking forward to. So, it's an action-adventure story. It's well-paced, never felt like a drag to read. It made me curious to know what's going to happen next. It made me really wanting to know what's going to happen next. And it's a solid story overall. I mean, there's really nothing more I can say other than that. And I would say it's worth what I paid. So I'm not disappointed in the least. Is it a perfect work? No. But it's good for what it is. And I would definitely suggest donating to the second run of the book if it's something that you're interested in reading. It definitely checks off the boxes, at least on the nostalgic level. But even then, it's just a fun read overall. It's one that I could see myself reading again. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I don't really have much else to say beyond what I've already said. That's kind of my overall take on the book.